I've been through numerous tech sales interviews, and I've actually led them as well. And I've helped a ton of people make that transition into tech sales. So I just wanted to make a quick video detailing what you can expect if you're going through the tech sales interview for the first time or maybe brushing up on your skills. Not only the entire process, but each individual step of the way, what those different interviews look like, who you might be talking to, and what you might be expected to do and perform in the interview itself. Almost every organization now has multiple rounds of interviews, usually a minimum of 3 to 4, with a maximum maybe even more on the extreme side of even like 7 rounds or 8 rounds to interview candidates who are trying to break into their sales organization. And typically, it's gonna break out in a few different ways. So for one thing, we do have a separate video about how to optimize your resume. And again, we're gonna assume that you've already gotten asked to interview, though we do have separate content dedicated to how you can position yourself to even get that interview in the first place. But that being said, your first call is typically going to be, if it's with a larger company, a dedicated recruiter, or maybe a smaller company, it could be with an HR person if they have one, or directly with the sales manager. Now, that call is typically gonna be more informal. They're gonna ask you about your background, maybe look into your resume a little bit, but they're also gonna ask you why you wanna work for them, why you wanna work in tech sales if you're transitioning to tech sales for the first time, and also your salary expectations. Again, depending on the company, if you've done a lot of research, if it's a bigger organization, there's probably a lot of info on sites like Glassdoor, etc., about the interview process that you should definitely look into. If it's a smaller company, they're still gonna expect you to be on point, and I would definitely encourage you to prepare, but also in many times with a startup, they're much more able to flush out for a culture fit as well as a fit who can actually execute on the role. So in those cases, the conversations are very informal. It's more looking to get a feel for if it's worth continuing the process, making sure your expectations are in line with the role, particularly around salary and around expected duties, etc. But at that point, you'd move into a more serious interview, which typically is a discovery call or a mock cold call scenario. Now, obviously that's not a rule that's set in stone. You may have companies that have you interview with multiple people, like a manager and an individual contributor, like a fellow SDR or an account executive, before you get into the more serious sales types of interviews, like a mock discovery call or something of that nature. But let's say you've got 1 or 2 interviews that are pretty informal. You're getting to know the team. They're trying to assess if at a minimum, you're a culture fit. Now, as we transition into interview 2 or 3 here, depending on the order, we're gonna get into the more serious sales skills that they're going to want to assess to not only see where you're at today, but also if you're coachable. Now again, if you have never done a discovery call before, this is gonna be on you to do some research both on YouTube, on the internet, what is a discovery call in tech sales, etc., etc. But in short, you're going to be in a scenario in this more intensive interview where they're pretending to be a potential prospect that you're either purely cold calling, or maybe a demo has been set up and now you need to walk them through your product and better understand their needs as well. If you're new to tech sales, again, we have dedicated content for discovery calls. There's a lot on the internet that you should look and research to get different perspectives. But you're going to be expected to, at a minimum, know the product a little bit. By no means do you have to be an expert, but you should study up on the product on the website. You should look at customer success stories, learning the kinds of benefits that people are getting from that product. So you can then come into the interview and not only know the product, but also ask them about, in this mock call, what the challenges they're facing are. What kind of budget are they planning to use for this type of tool? What kind of growth are they experiencing, etc. Again, you don't have to be an expert, but the important thing here is that you can show them that you can engage in a meaningful conversation and you've at least done a little bit of research on the product or the vertical that it's in. Like, again, you don't have to be an expert, but it's worth putting in a couple hours to better understand it because that's gonna set you apart from other candidates along that way. So now that you've made it through the discovery call, a lot of candidates don't make it through that point, and you're likely at that point between maybe 2 to 5 candidates at most that are being considered for the opening. At that point, depending on the company size, the structure, you're likely going to have a meeting with a director, with a VP, and in the case of a small startup, maybe even a CEO. And that's either gonna be done in panel form or broken out in separate calls again. Really at that point, mostly assessing the culture fit and trying to see if you're serious about working for them. And then also, if they do give you any type of role play scenarios, they'll usually give you a heads up there. But once you have that major discovery call that's dedicated for that role play scenario, it's unlikely that you'd have as strict of a scenario again. Though I won't speak for everyone, there's always exceptions. If you're going for an SDR entry-level tech sales role, that's probably the last or second to last interview that you're gonna have. The only final interviews that you may see beyond that are calls with other directors, maybe other VPs within the company, and they may do a similar situation where they're also flushing out your ability to have a sales type of scenario or role play. But also at that point, if you're that far in, particularly at a large company, they're gonna be flushing you out again for a culture fit, for the personality fit for the role. So just recapping again, usually you're gonna have 1 or 2 calls that are more entry level and trying to assess your personality. That's going to be with like a recruiter and or potentially a sales manager. At that point, if you're flagged as a good fit, both from your resume, the background that you're bringing, and also the conversations that you've had, they'll bring you in and assess more of your sales aptitude and ability to learn in more of a role play type of scenario with what is commonly called a discovery call, or they may give you a type of exercise where you have to draft up cold emails, maybe come up with a cold call script about their product. But the important thing there is you don't have to be an expert and you don't have to get everything right. But you can communicate through the research that you've done on the product and how you perform during that scenario that at a minimum, you've already done a lot of research that was largely self-guided, and the things that you don't necessarily do perfectly well, you can talk about them after the call and say, hey, I felt like I didn't do this that well. What do you think about how I performed in this capacity, etc.? And it's not about being the perfect candidate. It's about showing, again, that you're learning about the process, you've made a lot of progress already, and you're willing to take feedback and acknowledge on areas you can improve. That's arguably more important than being like the most polished person in the world. As you get through that interview, at that point, if you are continuing to go on through the process, it's likely down to you and maybe 2 to 5 other candidates at most. At that point, you're probably going to meet with a VP, with a director, maybe the CEO, and it's again probably a culture fit. At that point, they've probably assessed the hard skills of everyone are more or less on par, and they're from there trying to decipher which one they would think is the best fit. It's not going to be as casual as those calls with HR, with that initial sales manager, whatever it might be. But at that point, again, being very on the ball, being very articulate, showing why you want to work there are things that are going to be very important throughout. But those types of content and the advice that I can provide there is a separate video in of itself. So I hope that gave you a framework. Again, we made content about how to optimize your resume to even get these interviews in the first place, and we either have or are making more content around how to perform in each one of those different types of interviews. So I hope that helps. Appreciate your time, and we'll see you next week.